Welcome to this tutorial where we'll be creating tree bark, and we're not going for any specific type of bark here. I got a couple of requests from people wanting me to just go through the steps of some kind of generic type barks that you can customize for your project and turn into any type of bark essentially. We'll be going through the following steps. We'll start with creating these type of cells. If we look at our reference here, starting to create like some kind of cell pattern that mimics the shapes of this type of bark. And secondly, we will start combining them with some noise to get something more bark-like. And lastly, we'll add some details and layering effects to make it a little more realistic and make it flow together as one whole composition. And then we'll end with looking at our color and diffuse and roughness. Not really visible in these reference pictures here is knots. I guess we have some stuff here. So we'll cover how to set that up as well. So let's go into Substance and see what we can do. So we'll start by creating a new substance, and I'm on 2019.1.1. Let's call this bark tutorial. And I have my little Explorer view here on the other screen. Why can't I move that? There. So I just leave that off to get some screen real estate. And I'm using my standard base setup node here that I always use, and it's included in this tutorial as well. So we won't use metallic for this. I'll just go ahead and delete that first. Save that. So we're going to start by creating the basis for our knots. So we're gonna dump in a tile sampler here. So we just want to create like a couple of random paraboloid shapes. So let's set this down a bit to 6. And we can go down here to mask random. Set this to 0.9, so we only get a few of these. We can play with the size a bit as well if we go up. So let's change the scale here. We can randomize the size a bit as well. Scale random. This looks a bit big. Let's leave them 0.8. And we can do a little position random. Let's see where that is. It's over here. If you do this too much, they're going to start overlapping, which is not what we want. So if I just show you guys, if I disable this, when we start doing this too high, you see they kind of combine, so we don't want that. So we just want them to just touch if ever. So maybe something 0.2, not 20. So here we're kind of making sure they're not touching. We can also do this offset to make sure that each row is offset from each other. And go and set this one back to 0.9. We can even set this offset to vertical if we want to push them down that way. We can introduce a little bit of random sizing here. So we mess with the shapes a tiny bit. Let's start with this. We can hook that up here. This is not how we're going to use them, but this is sort of the first step. Also, I think we want to change this to the Gaussian shape. Where is it? Just this one has more of a cone shape, where the paraboloid has more of a round fall off. And now we just need to crank these up. And I think for now we'll just delete this because this is a little bit distracting. So now we have a couple of random knots here that if I tweak my random seed, we will get random knot patterns showing up. So once we're getting further into our graph, we'll see that we can generate these infinite patterns very easily. So let's start with the actual bark shape. So I'm gonna use these this dystrophic noise. I'm going to rotate that. I'm going to set the amount to 16 and 24, which is something I tested out from before, which gives us a fair amount of vertical and horizontal information. Let's just look at a reference here real quick. So this will generate some of these cuts and also some of these horizontal cuts. But it's kind of just too straight, so we're gonna add a crystal 1. Set this to 16. Jesus. 16. And we can blur this a bit as well. Set this to 3. We're just gonna distort these guys ever so slightly. Maybe a little bit less. I have a new keyboard, that's why I keep messing up. Yeah, maybe like 5. So now I'm gonna use these knots to warp this. But first I need to massage these guys a bit. So I think I'm gonna start blurring these to just make them swell up a bit. And now they get really dim from the blur, so we're gonna just run them through auto levels. I want to make them a little bit more elongated, so I'm gonna run them through a non-uniform blur here. And this blur map will select this wire and insert an invert grayscale node. It's not doing much yet here, but if we flip the angle of these and then just tweak this so we get them to stretch out a bit. Now let's leave that at 1. And crank up the samples. And blades, yeah, let's go full out like that. Now we have our dots and they're kind of stretched out. And we want to, I want to run this through a high pass node. High pass grayscale just to create like a little bit of bright and dark shapes just for our warping here. So we're gonna put this guy through a vector warp grayscale and just shift drag that into the top And then we're going to hook this one up there, but select the line and say gradient map, so we convert this grayscale to a color. And now you see what this is doing. It's kind of creating these shapes here, but if I only did that without the high pass, it's just doing those weird curves all around. So this one creates like a little more weird warpiness around those knots, which is what we want in this case. Maybe we can set this down to half. And to make some cells out of these, we will run this guy through an edge detect. And this one we can set to 3, and we'll remove the roundness. So essentially now we've created these horizontal or vertical stripes essentially, and where we're getting into these very noisy knot areas, like the width is too wide, so it creates these black areas, but that's actually okay. But what about our horizontal lines? So we're going to do that as well. So what we'll do here, as you see here, we have these long gradients based on this anistrophic noise. So we will run this through a quantize grayscale, which will actually start stair-stepping these. So we'll just need to dial a value in here. We don't want that many, but 3, it looked okay, but maybe this 5 looks a little bit better. So let's kill the roundness here. That looks a little bit big. Essentially now we'll just combine these two together by multiplying. So you see now we have something that starts resembling our reference here. Bunch of these vertical lines, maybe this one is a better example. Vertical lines with some horizontal stepping. So that's our first step. We're going to continue with our bark here. So let's just group these end nodes here so we can move them around easily. As you can see here, there's a bit of noise inside these knot areas. So we want to remove that. So we're gonna do I'm gonna grab a mask from this auto level. So let's create a histogram scan, and we'll just grab this guy. And we'll move it down here somewhere. Just up the contrast a whole bunch. We want to keep it binary. We don't want any fade here. So we will just blend. Just subtract that. See if there's any one of these. We could maybe expand this guy a bit more. I don't think that will be a problem. Let's leave that. So what we're doing with this now is we want to create a proper cell pattern out of this using the flood fill node. So let's dump down a flood fill here. So a complete cell grid will need like different grayscale values for these sort of watertight islands, and then we'll use the distance node to grow them so they will kind of grow into each other organically. So first we'll use this flood fill, and we'll dump this random grayscale down here, and then we'll use a distance node here. And we'll swap that and put this one into mask. And we can set this one to something incredibly high. So now we have cells that grow into each other, and around these knot areas, they're kind of like pinching into the center, which is kind of cool. Let's move this off a bit, get more space. And this guy, now we can run this through an edge detect. Let's try some values here. Yeah, it's fine that we're dropping out some of these, because what we want here now is, let me find a good reference picture for this. Yeah, here's a pretty good one. Like breaking off from the vertical things, we want something to start going into this kind of circular shape. So what I'm going to use for that is, we're going to go back and use these. And we're going to run them through a quantize node as well. So let's add a quantize node here. And we can just make sure we get a couple of rings on here. So we'll set this to maybe 8, 7. Let's start with 7 and see how that looks. We'll run this through an edge detect as well. Yeah, they can be a little bit like that. And then we'll just combine these two together. So now we have these, where we have these super pinchy points here, we also have these circles coming in and around these. And this one, we'll just run this through a bevel node. Something like that. And this one we can actually hook up to C. Yeah, starting to look like something. Obviously it looks very like mathematical and everything. We'll see what we can do about that. So let's combine these cell shapes with a little bit of this shape we have here. So we have this kind of shape that goes out here on the tops and then it goes in a bit around. It's kind of cool looking. So, but it looks like here at this point it goes to full white. So I kind of want to combine it with itself by blurring this. We can set this to the high quality and then maybe something high. And then we just crossfade the two. Something like that, so that we're not reaching white here anymore. And we'll combine that with our refined cells here. Yeah, some kind of gamey, half stylized looking bark. I don't know, like this super weird edge here. I'm sure it's gonna disappear eventually. It could just be removed by changing the random seed here, probably. And you can see already how the random seed are creating these kind of cool patterns for us. So let's just go back to 0 for now. Once we have the full graph, we can just random seed forever to find the perfect bark for us. So actually to modify this incoming shape here a bit more, we can run this through a curve node. And we can like add this little dip in the center. We can make that as deep or strong as we want to. You guys can be flexible with that, but I think something like this. Looks pretty good. And save. Don't forget to save. Actually, we can also run this guy through auto level, so we make sure we get more values, because we're going to put some sort of destructive effects on this. Maybe we'll lower this. Actually, we can switch these around, so we can select both by control clicking, and then just hit X. I think that feels a bit better. Let's look back at our reference. Okay, so the next step here is we can add a bit more diversity to our shapes here. They're pretty much, perfect, and there's no kind of sloping action going on inside these individual cells. So let's go back here to our flood fill. And flood fill to gradient. That's what we want to use. Let's do it, this way, I guess, or this way. I guess it doesn't matter. And we'll run this guy through a distance node. I guess we just do this. And we can just also randomize the angle variation. Just to add a little more noise on the signal here. And it's actually a use of bevel node from this shape here. I'll set it to the same. And blend this with this using multiply. It's barely noticeable here, but if I put a normal node in here just for debug, we can see that we now have a little bit of angles compared to this. So I think that's good to have there, a little more randomness. And what we also could do here is to further break up this perfect pattern with put a blend node and put some cells 1 in here. keep all our noise functions down here. We'll set this one to 8 and multiply. Just lower this a lot. We can actually run this through levels where we try to just keep some of these kind of crack patterns in here. Just pull the white side down a bit. Yeah, that looks kind of neat. So now we just need to combine these two together. And we can use the height blend node for that. So this will be top and this will be bottom. Now the knots are kind of pushed in, so we want to push this up a bit so the knots come out, and we flatten our base patterns a bit. Yeah, it looks more organic and a bit more weird, which is good in this case, than that. And next we'll add a little more shaping here, because now we kind of like, it got a little bit flattened again. Obviously we can resolve that here by, you know, pushing these guys out more. But I think this is a pretty good level. You can play with this as well, the contrast. It's kind of cool. Like if you go all the way up to 1, you get this super sharp contrast. But if we leave this at 0.9, it kind of, that artifact creates something pretty cool in terms of shaping. So we'll leave it in. Let's start introducing a little bit more shaping in here, a little more details. Obviously all these shapes are super perfect. We have this kind of jaggedy, ugly line that comes from this distance node here. I wish there was a better solution for this, where this could be softened out, but it's what we have to deal with. So let's add a slope blur. We'll crank this up. And as the source, we'll use the directional noise. 4, I think. It's pretty nice and like soft. We'll angle it so it comes from the top. We'll move this one down here. Can actually start framing these guys. We can keep all our noise functions down here. Just so they're easy to find once, or if we ever come back into this graph, or if you're sharing it with your coworkers. That looks pretty interesting. Maybe it's a little bit heavy-handed. No, I think we'll leave it at 0.5. The thing I don't like about it right now, it's chewing up our circles here. So let's try to find a way around that. I think what I'll do here is we'll blend it back with itself, but we'll try to mask these circles out. So let's copy this histogram scan noise that we use as a mask here to subtract. So all I did was copy that, hook it up to this thing, and we can move this one forward. And here we don't want to make it super contrasted like this, because you see it creates this laser line here. So we'll fade that into each other more. And save that. And now these guys are left without any detail at all. So we need to do something for those guys as well. So let's do a save transform. Let's grab this noise again. Can tile that a lot, 7 times. We'll do a directional blur. Yeah, 10 is fine. And this noise, we want that to conform to these knots again. So we can go back and actually steal this node here. See if that works. Create a bunch of like circly things, and then I will use my custom node, which should also be included, otherwise it's free on my Gumroad. It's just my directional warp node. So we're going to put this one in there, and we're going to put our main shape as our intensity input, just to wave these lines or shake them up a bit based on our main shape. It always looks weird if you have, a noise that's doing something and it doesn't flow with the shapes. So we put that in here, and we can blend that. We can do an overlay. That was way too strong, so let's just tone it down, maybe 0.5. Even that looks too much. It's kind of killing too much of the shapes. We can try the maybe reduce the amount of noise to get some bigger shapes. Yeah, maybe even bigger. That looks alright. And to just finish some of these shapes off a bit, I think it's maybe too strong still. And here we can obviously tweak this mask as well to see how they should fade into each other. And just to make these shapes come together a bit more, we're going to use slope blur. I'm going to crank this up. And we're going to set our intensity to maybe 0.05. And we're going to use itself as source, so it's sort of inflating the shapes. But if we do a little more blur here, we can control the effect here. Yeah, something like that. They start sort of bleeding into each other. If you want a deflate type effect, you can just use a negative value here, actually. So it depends on what kind of bark you're going for, but in this case I want to do an inflate. We have something that looks like fairly natural. I want to do a little more shaping on here. So I think maybe before this step we can even we can blend these shapes back on here. And we can use an overlay for that. If we select that line, we can also add a directional blur. And we'll set it this direction. And we'll crank it up a bit, just so we get more elongated shapes. And I guess looking at some of our reference, getting more of these kind of long undulations of the shape, if that makes any sense at all. It's like a little more bubbly shape. That looks pretty good, I think. And I think what I would do next here is to hijack this directional warp node here. Just want to massage this shape a bit more, and we can use a clouds 1 node here. Yeah, default values. Set this to intensity input. And we don't want to distort it this much, although we can just hook that up to see what that looks like. Completely destroys the shape. I'm just going to tone down the intensity here to 2. Maybe just 2 directions. This kind of stuff is up to you guys, what you're going for. So I'm sort of doing this by eye. Yeah, that looks alright. Let's save. So let's start looking at some details here. I want to add a little more graininess and like some layering effects here as well. So the first thing we could do here is put down a black and white spots. Throw that one down here as well. Put a blend here. And then we will subtract. We'll set this one down really low. Just introduce a tiny bit of noise here. That looks pretty nice, I think. This texture has a lot of like dark to bright spots, so I think we just want to high pass this. High pass will eliminate, you saw the difference here. This underlying cloud shape is now gone if we run it through a high pass. Which means our noise will be just more even across the surface. Let's leave that on there for now. Yeah, just a bit of this sort of bumpy noise is sort of what we introduced here with this. Let's look at some layering here as well. Let us do let's dump in auto levels in here, and we'll just grab this just so we get the full range. I want to run this through a quantize, which just creates these steps based on how many levels we put in the quantize here. So it takes this input and it divides it into 3 distinct grayscale values. So here we have black and white and medium gray. But let's set this to 25 maybe. And you see here now we get, if we go back to our input here, instead of this smooth transition, we now get this layering, which is really good for Bark because it has a lot of layering. All these kind of like chips sort of that's stacked on top of each other. Disclaimer for this node is that you go here from L16, which is 16-bit, to L8, but you can try to set this node to 16-bit, but it actually doesn't do anything. So depending on how we use it, pay attention to, like, you know, if you put a sloper after this sloper is now 8-bit, so it's going to be of a lower quality. Let's just, for now, we just blend this on top here. So you see this node here is L16, and if I connect this one, which is in the foreground layer, it keeps the node 16. But if I do a control click and select both of these and I flip, it's now L8. So it's the background layer that defines what bit depth you get on this node. So we're going to hook it up this way. And we're just going to fade this down to something low. And you see now, like, we start getting these layers on here. But I think it looks too mathematical right now, so what I'd like to do in this case, let's just get some more space, is to actually go in and sort of distort this a bit. So we can hijack our directional warp node here. Crank up the intensity and we can set it to more vectors. we can see we can actually use our main shape here. So this is without, and this is with the layering here. And this is without our additional displacement of that. When you're using our base shape here as a displacement, it just makes it follow the shapes in a more interesting ways. So let's leave this at 15. That looks pretty neat. One thing with the quantize node is that it introduces, like perfect division, like there's no blur or any transition between these values at all. But when I use this directional warp, it adds a bit of blur. You see here this transition. It might be hard to see there, but it actually introduces some blurriness there as well. But you could put another blur node on here with something extremely low here, like a 0.1 if you want those layers to bleed over a bit more. Maybe a more, yeah, you see a tiny bit of difference. It's not so bad for maybe the height, but for the normal you get a super sharp transition. Maybe 0.15, just a little bit softer. That looks pretty good. And another thing I like to do is we could introduce an AO node here. Just introduce a bit more negative shape in our texture. Let's set down the radius to something really low just to just outline the deepest crevices, maybe even lower. Yeah, we can see what that looks like. And we can just multiply that on top of our shape. And obviously just scale this down to something low. Yeah, here, this you also need to do sort of by eye, and you can play around with the radius. We can even go in here and play with the levels a bit. If you move this white point up, so we can kill all these and just leave the dark areas. I think that looks pretty good. Just kills some of that the perfect kind of shape we got. So yeah, we kind of have some knots going here. If we want these to look like they're kind of sawed off, so there was a branch here before, let's play around with that idea. Let's add a height blend node here. And put that as the bottom node. what we can do here is we go back and grab one of our initial shapes here. Let's grab this one, this histogram scan, which has the knots at the right spot. We can make them a little bit smaller. And we can do like a little bit of a distance just to get a little bit outline of them. Maybe crank up this a bit. The cool thing about using the height blend node here is that we're going to get this mask for free. So we're going to get this mask how these two shapes intersect each other. So once we're doing color, we now have a perfect mask for for where these sort of knots show up. Otherwise, there's no really good way of finding that mask, but this one gives it to you for free. And we can go in and maybe like darken these hits a bit more. If I undo what I did there, you can see sort of like lowering this curve here. We'll make that knot a little bit bigger, so we can fit in our little branch cap a little bit better. Yeah, some of those twigs stick out a bit more. Let's try to make these look a bit more like ends of a branch or something like that. So the first thing we want to do is we'll go back to this tile sampler here. We can actually let's expose this value, this X amount, and then we just click somewhere, just anywhere, and then go back. And then we'll hook this Y amount up to this X amount. If you try to do that right away, it's not going to work for some reason. So now we copy this tile sampler. It's Control C and Control V, and we'll put it down here somewhere. So what I want to do is like on top of these blobs, I just want to add like the branch end. So I'm going to use this tile sampler here. I'm going to add a shape. We can use this paraboloid shape. And we're going to use this Cartesian to polar. And we can grab maybe this one. So you see how this almost looks like a top of a tree or something like that. So we're going to blend these two guys together. Just multiply these together. We're going to run these into this tile sampler here. And instead of Gaussian, we set this to pattern input. So now we have these guys. We can actually go down to it's a bit more rotation random because they were all the same. We can do a bit more scale random even. Otherwise we want them to be the same. So if we globally, we just click empty canvas here, we go to our X amount. So if we change this amount for whatever reason, this guy, this tile sampler, and this guy will match. because everything else is going to work on random seed, but we want these two tile samplers to be connected. So if you can expose like scale and stuff and hook them both up to the same one, so they work the same way. You can set this back to 6. And we'll just blend on top of this. We'll blend this detail, and we can try to find a good blend mode for that. Obviously now it just sort of disappeared from here. So we'll try maybe min darken and set it to, you see there, from that to something kind of branch-like. And just some little bit organic damage from our shape that we spend so much time building. Just organize this a bit. That looks pretty good. I'm gonna add another one of my special nodes here. Let's see, this one is also included in your download. This is my low pass node, to get some of these shapes to meld together a bit more. So if you want to recreate this node, it's just a bunch of blur steps in layers, maybe 3. You can set the amount here, and it's just like the amount of blurring steps it's doing at different distances, and you can fade the effect here, and you can say the amount. But if you look at the normal here, and we go back to this, see how it kind of just softens everything. Stuff is just pulling a bit more in the same direction. So that looks pretty nice. We have stuff that pulls together, and I think the only thing that's sort of missing on here now is everything is just going straight up and down, all the way down. So we want to include some directional warp here. And we'll use Perlin noise. Just as bark is growing, to make it feel more organic, you see on this guy, for instance, here you see there's a bit of curvature here. And you see this line here, for instance, it's kind of like, it's not going straight up this way, it's slightly curving. And same here, you can sort of see some curvature there. So we'll add a Perlin noise, set it to, maybe we'll try 6, 4. We'll set this one to 30 maybe. You see now with this soft Perlin noise, you kind of get these nice swoops. You can play with the distance, you can go even lower here. Or you can random seed this guy if you don't like that effect. I think this looks pretty neat. We'll clone this because we want to use the exact same values, and we're going to keep our mask. So we want this to remain in the same spot. So we're going to do the same for that. fade that low pass effect out a bit. Yeah, I think that looks pretty neat. Though in the next section, we'll go through the some of the colors and see what we can do with that. Let's start having a look at our base color. We can start by just killing this frame for now because we don't need it. Let's move these guys over here. Let's copy this AO. I'm just going to set up a couple of nodes that we probably will need for this. So one AO node where we can control separately from our output AO. Just want to pull, make it a little deeper, more contrasty. Something like that. Normal, I typically just leave it around 25. It looks pretty good to me. Looks good with this amount of displacement I have here. So that one is fine. We need like a slope mask. So let's do a split on this, and we'll grab our blue channel here. We can just run this through a histogram scan. Essentially, the blue channel is all the slopes, and we're just contrasting it up here. So this will be one of our masks we'll use. This is my dog walking around here. If you hear noises. Yeah, so here we have a couple of masks that might be useful for us. So let's start. We'll just detach this thing here. And just worry about our roughness later. So, and I will shrink this window because we're going to start color picking from our reference. And as I said before, this is not any typical bark. It's just like a very generic type of bark. So I think we'll just grab color from this one here. Let's grab a gradient map here. And we can use our super slopey mask here. Let's see, so we get some values in here. Let's invert these. Typically with this kind of stuff, like the fewer values, the better. If I would grab, like, there'll be so much information here. You can even like clear them all and select and pick just the value you want. I'm just looking for something that can create a good base here for me. So let's start with this. So where it's flat, it's mainly this kind of like, I don't even know how to talk about that color. A little bit brownish green. And the edges get a little bit darker. I guess we have this value and sort of this value. Let's add another gradient here. We can pick our like AO mask. Let's pick a bunch of these colors here that are sort of doing the same thing, but with a little more noise, just so we have. See, like I don't like these super dark areas, so we can select these and just throw them up like that. And go and really like, I want to edit out some of this super contrasty stuff. And like I mentioned before, this is not an exact science really either. You're picking and combining and layering stuff together until you get something that looks the way you want. And sometimes if I like something, I copy paste my gradient map so I can go back. Oh, I just want to try something a bit different here. Maybe a bit more green on there. This is our backup, but I don't think we'll need it, so just ditch that one for now. Let's use this curvature. Can throw this through in auto levels. Since it didn't do much, we can try to just manipulate this with a curve node. Get something a little bit weird and different. And this. Use a histogram on this curvature node to get like the tops. This one is too reddish still. You can select all the nodes or a portion of the nodes and manipulate these. Use saturation and value sliders here. Also this RGB, but I never really used those. I'm just gonna keep playing around with the colors, and I won't narrate this step, so we'll just speed it up, but you'll get the full process. So let's have a look at what we did here. I tweaked around a bit and found something that I sort of sort of liked. I changed a bunch of the colors. I just massaged the values so it looked more like the reference, or some of my reference. I added this grunge map here, just one of the default ones included, and these are the values here. I tried to get low contrast, and I used my warp node here to just warp it based on our height, just so it's flowing over those surfaces. And I mixed it into this gradient map that I just blended on top here using this dirt node. So this dirt node is pretty cool. It has a bunch of settings here where you can like add grunge, and you can play with the contrast and stuff of it. So I wanted to create some of these pits are like this kind of reddish material here. So you can see some of the crevices kind of expose some of this colored bark. This node I recommend. It has a bunch of, you can change the frequency of the grunge and that kind of stuff. It's all built in. Or you could use a custom grunge map. You can get that input there. So I think after this step, what I will want to do here is run a grayscale conversion. So for the same reason as we're grabbing a noise here and distorting it based on the shape, we now have this super interesting information here in our graph. We created this color that's doing stuff that the shape is doing, but it's also doing different stuff. So if we convert this to grayscale, we just put a little bit of a blur on it. Set this to 0.15 or something like that. There's a boundary level. If you set this to 0.1, it's like the blur is not going to do enough, and if you set it to 0.2 or something, it's going to be way too much. And then we convert this into a normal, and we blend this back into a normal. Let's see if I can see that here. So if I just do this, it's going to create like way too much noise, and it's going to kind of work against the normal map. So this amount of blur will help. If I set this to sort of 0.1, it's too similar to 0. So I found that the sort of the perfect value is around like 13 for 13 or 14 or something like that. And then we'll take this and we'll blend it back onto our normal combine. And this one is default set to low quality for whatever reason, so we want to set that to high and combine our normals in. So if we double click on our incoming normal and our outgoing, it's now doing like a bunch more interesting things. But be careful here. I wouldn't go this far. Maybe something just like that. This is something you can tweak once you render it, or if you're doing this for a game, you throw it into the game and you can mess around with these settings. What these detail normals are doing is they're, messing with your overall composition. Like some of these nice layered values here become a little bit more noisy. So, here in this part of our main normal, it's going to introduce like a bit more noise. So be careful with those. So a couple of things we're missing here is we will add a blend node here. And we will grab one of these masks here. Let's see. Let's just copy this guy for now. And we'll just hook it up to curvature. Maybe hook it up to this one. What I want to do here is just add these end pieces of the end wood on these knots here. So we're going to grab our mask that we had here from before. So we get a different color on those, and that obviously looked not good. We can actually try to use this mask, or maybe even this. Let's actually let's copy this thing. And yeah, the problem here is I need to do this warp thing here as well. You see, now I saw that it didn't line up there, so I need to add the global warping to that as well. We can actually frame this section and say like global warp, so we don't forget. Looks like really fresh wood right now, so let's maybe kill some of these brighter values here. And maybe even like that looks a bit better. So now we have a separate color for those. And let's add a dust node here at the end. We'll grab our AO as an input. And here we can grab our combined normal, because now this normal has way more information. And this dust node is working on it's not a node that is meant to use these kind of tangent space. It needs a world space normal, which means in my case it's kind of like flipped. I want the dust to come from above, so we need to put a invert normal. Now our dust is accumulating from the top. And here we can either use a uniform color, we can grab one of the colors from here. You can play with the blend modes as well. Kind of like what that was doing. Let's have a look at our roughness here, what we can do. So we can start here and we can use a grayscale conversion so we get some of these, random shapes. Bark is a pretty rough material, so we can make it pretty bright as a default. You can set this to black here. Pretty hard to see, actually. I need to swap out my environment map here. Find my library. I can try this one. And add some fractal sum base noise. Let's blend our slope noise on here, or slope mask. Just put an invert grayscale on there, but I'm going to just dock it. So we want to add, so when it's sloping, it's killing off a bit more. Change this to, we can do add sub maybe. Just want this to add a bit more interest. We can also add our dust on here. My tendency is always to make stuff a bit more shiny than they really are, because if you look at a lot of photogrammetry reference, it's typically like, the roughness map looks like that. It's like all white, and it's kind of boring. Can tweak the contrast here. I think that's my recommendation to you all. Just get your hands on some really good photogrammetry references and try to dial in. At least they are, narrated in a way and in a consistent way to work well together. If you look at something like Megascans or CG Textures, they're tweaked together with other stuff, so they all work well together. So in a production environment where you work alongside photogrammetry stuff and you're making stuff like this, at least your values will be in check with those. But if you're doing something, hyper real, kind of like sort of Dishonored style art style, you can take a little more liberties there. I think finally we can add, so our the ends of our knots, we can just add that mask so they are always completely rough. We can tone this down to 0 again. It's back to normal. Maybe 1. See what we're doing. I typically render all my stuff in Marmoset, and the range of the AO in there needs to be very different. So this is something that works well in Marmoset and in game engines, but in here, if you want to make something look okay, you need to kind of crank up your AO a bit more. But it's just for this viewport, I've noticed. Height, I think our height looks fine. If you notice tearing and that kind of stuff in your renders, which I see a lot, you could add a blur node here and blur your height map, ever so slightly. Maybe something like 0.3, but you'll see that if you use but I will blur after, because you don't want to blur your normals, you just want to blur your height. And now it's just a matter of exporting and see what it looks like in Marmoset and do additional tweaks based on that. Typically, dial in a bit of normals and tweak the AO and swap around the colors maybe a bit. That always takes the longest time. So let's jump over to Marmoset and see the final product. And this is pretty much it, what we made today. Kind of like a generic bark, has some knots. Obviously, tweakable amounts of knots. So just mess with the exposed value here. Name it correctly as well. We can call it knot amount or something like that. And play with the random seed. See the bark update. Super awesome. It's my favorite thing to do, I think. Yeah, this is the final render, and I also have a scene render that we looked at earlier. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll be updating my platform with new tutorials the coming months here. So send me feedback if you have any stuff you want to see. Thanks for watching.